It's always a pleasure to be joined by Paul Bretl of Dairyland Express whenever we're talking about the Green Bay Packers. And if you haven't had a chance to read it yet on Dairyland Express, Paul did a really detailed breakdown of everything that happened at the 2022 draft. And for a Packers fan, it is truly a must read. Paul, thanks for being with me, spending some time.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. Always enjoy joining you.
Yeah. So I want to start with Davante Wyatt. What are the Packers getting in a defensive lineman like him?
This was my favorite pick in the draft because what an interior defensive lineman can do for an NFL defense. So having him in the middle, it's going to give Joe Barry, the defensive coordinator, more freedom to move Kenny Clark around. And that means more one-on-one opportunities, and that's always a good thing. In addition to that, with Wyatt's ability to get after the quarterback with that quick first step, that's the best way. That's the quickest way to blow up any play, quick interior pressure. On top of that, occupying space, taking on double teams, that's going to help keep the linebackers and safeties clean. Really, when you have a strong interior presence, in addition to Kenny Clark, of course, because we all know how fantastic he is, the entire defense can benefit. So I really love this selection, and Packers fans for several years now have been clamoring, get Kenny Clark some help. Well, they got him some help. And then when you pair that with Dean Lowry, who's coming off of arguably his best season from a pass rush presence, they signed Jerron Reed in free agency. Hopefully TJ Slayton can take a step forward in year two. This is definitely the best interior defensive line rotation that this team's had in several years.
And you feel that Wyatt is ready to contribute right away?
Yep, absolutely. I think I won't be surprised if we get to next February, season's over, and we look back and he made the biggest impact out of any rookie on this team.
Offensively, when you look at the offensive line, how compelling are some of the battles for starting spots that we're going to see this offseason heading into the season?
Very. I mean, offensive line was one of the bigger needs. I don't think it was talked about very much before the draft, but coming into it, the only healthy offensive tackles were Bakhtiari and Yash Nyman. And Yash did well filling in last season, but if he starts, he's moving from left tackle to right tackle. And yes, that's offensive tackle, but that's a whole different ball game. In addition to that, he only has about 600 career NFL snaps. He's still a young, inexperienced player, and they needed competition there until Elton Jenkins can return from his ACL injury. And then along the interior as well, the only backups that they had were two centers, Jake Hansen and Michael Manette. They're late round draft picks, little experience, and then Cole Van Landen could play the guard positions. Again, a late round pick with minimal NFL experience. We saw last year with all the injuries that the Packers had along the offensive line, how important depth is, and they were lacking that, but not anymore. They found two very Green Bay Packer-esque selections in Sean Rhyan and Zach Tom, both versatile, both I imagine will get opportunities to compete for the starting right tackle spot. Zach Tom could play center, he could play guard. Sean Rhyan could play guard. So right now, the only spot I would Sharpie in that we know where a player is going to be starting is David Bakhtiari at left tackle. Now, it doesn't mean that John Runyan won't be starting because I think he has very good odds, but that's the only one at this point I would Sharpie in. So I think there's going to be a ton of competition along the offensive line this summer, and that's a very, very good thing.
And when you say Green Bay Packers-esque lineman or player, for somebody that's not a diehard Packers fan, what do you mean specifically by that?
Very athletic and versatile. They can play multiple positions along the offensive line. That versatility is something that Brian Gutekunst and Matt LaFleur, they covet heavily along the offensive line. And Zach Tom and Sean Rhyan, they can both play tackle. They can both play along the interior as well.
Did the Packers do enough at the wide receiver position in the draft? I mean, Davante Adams, unfortunately for Packers fans, is gone. He's not coming back. Is this going to be a weakness for them?
Well, it's not going to be as strong as it was. I'll say that. What they did do was they added speed and playmaking ability throughout this draft, which is what they needed. Matt LaFleur mentioned that at the owners meeting about a month ago. Christian Watson brings 4.36 speed. He's going to be able to step in right away and be that downfield vertical presence that they're missing with MVS now in Kansas City. On top of that, he took a number of snaps out of the backfield while at North Dakota State. And not that I expect him to be lined up in the backfield when you have Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon, but he can be utilized in that gadget role, be the motion man, quick screens, get him the ball in space. So those are two areas where he's going to be able to make an impact right away. Romeo Doubs is another big play threat, and Brian Gutekunst referenced him being a polished receiver. Obviously, he still has areas that he can improve. And then Samori Toure, again, another speed, big play guy, averaged almost 20 yards per catch at Nebraska. So they added some needed speed and playmaking, which they did not have prior to the draft. And if, like I mentioned, the wide receiver room isn't going to be nearly as good as it was. But for the Green Bay Packers to be effective, it's going to rely heavily on Matt LaFleur's scheme. He's been touted for his ability to scheme players open, and he's going to need to do that more than what he has in the past when you maybe don't have a Davante Adams who can create that space on his own. And then a lot of it as well, it's going to fall on Aaron Rodgers, back-to-back MVP, 4-time MVP. He's going to have to elevate this group as well and flip into the defensive side of the ball. They're going to rely much more heavily on the defense than what they have in years. So the wide receiver room as a whole is going to be decreased, but you hope that with LaFleur's ability to scheme guys open, Aaron Rodgers being Aaron Rodgers, having that arguably the best running back duo in football, what looks like to be a very strong defense, that all of that can help elevate the team as a whole and close that gap from losing Davante Adams. So to answer the question, did they do enough? I'm not sure. I think as constructed, this receiver room can be good enough for the Green Bay Packers to win, of course, as long as those other things happen. This isn't going to be like years past where I don't expect them to lead the NFL in scoring like they did in 2020. I'll just say that.
We know that Aaron Rodgers feels really comfortable with Pat McAfee. He went on his show and he always kind of reveals a little bit more into some of the big questions that everybody's always speculating about. And so to hear him say that he was surprised that Davante Adams didn't stay with the Packers, a lot of people kind of took that and ran with it and was trying to really interpret what that means. I mean, how did you read those comments?
It's always tough to tell. But I do believe that he was surprised. I mean, we were all surprised to see Davante Adams go because, like I've talked about before, I think many of us thought that Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams were a package. If Rodgers said, "Hey, I'm out," I imagine the Packers are going to trade Adams as well. And if Rodgers said he's back, most of us thought that Adams was going to be back too. But I think also, I believe Rodgers knew of Adams' decision, before he signed the contract. So trying to put a positive spin on it, Rodgers mentioned, following the season that he didn't want to be a part of a rebuild. So he still thinks that he can win here, even without Davante Adams. We'll have to see how that all plays out. But, that hopefully gives Packer fans at least a little bit of confidence. But I think Rodgers was like the rest of us, surprised because there's obviously the connection that those two have on the field, but the Packers with a player like Davante Adams, they prioritize making that work and bringing them back. So there were a few, trends or, things that typically happen with the Green Bay Packers and their own free agents that just didn't align either. So like the rest of us, Rodgers was surprised.
One of the things you noted when you did your full draft breakdown on Dairyland Express is that the team decided not to touch the safety position and the tight end position in the draft. Why do you think they decided not to address those positions?
Yeah, so those were two needs that I expected them to fill. And they did draft Tariq Carpenter at safety in the 7th round, but I left him out of that article because supposedly he's going to be moved to linebacker. But the reason why there are such big needs is, one, that third safety role behind Savage and Amos is wide open, and it's a ton of youth and inexperience on the roster behind them. Also, as we look ahead to next year, which I know it can be forgotten about, but that's what the draft is about, planning ahead. Vernon Scott, who's an unknown, and Savage are the only players under contract. Josiah DeGuara is the only tight end under contract in 2023. So those are two big reasons, because the Packers do a good job of planning ahead at where they're going to have holes in the coming years. But in trying to figure out and speculate why they maybe didn't address those safety, I think it partially may have to do with drafting Quay Walker, the linebacker. And before I dive into that, I'll just add, the board just may not have felt correctly either. I doubt the Packers went into the draft saying, we're not going to draft these positions. The board probably didn't fall correctly. That didn't help things either. But with Quay Walker at linebacker, that allows Green Bay to play with a more true nickel defense, and that includes two linebackers. I kind of equated it to the chicken and the egg. Did the Packers play with one linebacker as often as they did last year because that's what they wanted to do, or because it was out of necessity? Well, based on this draft pick, it was out of necessity. So if you have two linebackers on the field more often, you don't need three safeties as often either. So perhaps that played a role in it. And then following the draft at tight end, Gutekunst mentioned that they really like what they have in Tyler Davis. They acquired him. I think they signed him off a practice squad early last season. He's a very willing and aggressive blocker, which we know the Packers and Matt LaFleur covet. And he made a few plays in the passing game as well. So obviously they've seen something in practice behind the scenes that they really like. So perhaps that was a reason as well why they didn't feel the need to necessarily have to reach at the tight end position.
And you also noted at the corner position, they have a number of players who can start and be really impactful. But, when you look at depth, as you kind of assess position by position, should Packers fans be concerned about the lack of depth at the corner position?
I think so. I mean, again, last year we saw how important it was. Jair goes out and they find Rasul Douglas off the practice squad to help boost that position. And it's easy to look at the three that they have because they could easily be the best cornerback trio in football this season. But behind them, again, it's a ton of youth and experience and question marks. And I think if they're going to make a free agent addition, that's one position to keep our eyes on. And again, it's not going to be a big name. It's not going to be any big dollar spent, but there's value in at least bringing someone in who maybe has 4, 5, 6 years of experience under their belt just to provide some stability, because that can be important if, hopefully it doesn't happen, but if someone has to leave a game due to an injury, you at least have that experience to lean on versus really what they have now is unknowns.
How much flexibility do the Packers actually have when it comes to potentially bringing in anybody else after they sign all the guys that they need to sign? You and I have talked about the salary cap before with this team and what may or may not be available. Do you see them making any additional significant additions, for lack of a better way of putting it? Do you see them adding anybody else that could be a difference maker?
If I was guessing, I would say yes, because this was a tweet from Andy Herman, a Packer report. He tweeted out, at this time a year ago, Devondre Campbell, Dennis Kelly started the playoff game. Rasul Douglas, Corey Bajorquez, their punter, none of them were Packers at this time a year ago. So we see these additions made over the summer as the roster evolves, or again, hopefully not, but injuries might happen. And from the cap standpoint, I do think the Packers have the ability to make a move if they wanted to bring in, again, another veteran presence on a veteran minimum type contract. It's not going to be Julio Jones or anyone like that, but cornerback and edge rusher are kind of the two positions that I have earmarked where, again, a veteran presence I think could do a lot, and you put them in a situational role where they can be successful. So over the cap has the Packers at about $14 million in available cap space. I know Rob Domofsky of ESPN tweeted out that the draft class, once they sign all 11 players, is going to account for 12.5-ish million. So obviously that doesn't leave you a ton of room, but the big move they still have left is an extension for Jair Alexander that will create cap space this year, maybe as high as $6-7 million. Alan Lazard, once he signs his restricted free agent contract, if they want to tack on voided years to that, again, that's a way to. They did that with Robert Tonyan last year in his restricted deal. So if they choose to do that again, that's a way to free up, a little bit of cap space as well. So there's some moves still available if they feel the need to maneuver to really go and, add some depth to this roster.
Is there a veteran edge rusher that comes to mind for you that you think like, hey, this would be a good guy for them to go get, especially if, as you noted on Dairyland Express, the coaching staff likes to have a rotational cast of 3 to 4 of those guys?
Yeah, I'd say the one that stands out would be Melvin Ingram. And that's what they need, because even as good as Rashawn Gary and Preston Smith were last year, when they weren't on the field, there was just a lack of impact plays. And obviously going from those two to your third and fourth option, there's going to be a drop off in play, but it was significant. And I think the addition of Kingsley Enagbare, who they drafted in the 5th round, I think he can provide a pass rush presence, third downs, obvious passing situations, but I'm not sure how much he's going to help against the run. And we know edge rusher's job is to get after the quarterback. That's what we watch for. Those are the stats we look at. But, containing that edge, setting the edge, being stout against the run is very important as well. And I'm not sure beyond Smith and Gary that they have that element. So again, a veteran presence could, certainly help provide that and shore up what is one of the most important positions in football, but also a heavily rotated one too. I mean, Gary and Smith, they played 68% of the snaps last season, and that's pretty normal. So that means a third of the defensive snaps every game those two are on the sidelines just because, again, it's a heavily rotated position. So having that depth is very, very important.
It seems like that position in particular is becoming more and more important, or is more important than ever in today's NFL. I think you're spot on with that. For Packers fans, before I let you go, Paul, when you assess everything that they've done in the draft from a 30,000 foot view, with the knowledge that they might be able to add a veteran here or there with some of the cap money that's left over, how would you grade how they did in the 2022 NFL draft?
I summed it up in 3 words. I said it was unexpected, but effective. Unexpected in the sense that they went with 2 defenders in the first round. I know we were all hoping for that receiver, but the board in round 1 from a receiver perspective was just very unkind to them. But it was effective in the sense that, we already talked about it. They added 3 receivers, speed, playmaking ability, which they were missing. Even before the draft, if you look at the defensive side of the ball on paper, Packer fans were happy with how it looked, but they addressed the 2 biggest weaknesses on what was already a pretty good defense, the second linebacker position and the interior defensive line rotation. The offensive line, again, they needed depth. They added that. They're going to have a ton of competition there. And then special teams. I know a lot of teams probably aren't talking about special teams in the offseason, but Packers fans are because of how the season ended. Watson, he could be their kick returner. He was an All-American kick returner at North Dakota State. Romeo Doubs, he has 37 career punt return attempts, I believe, averaged over 12 yards per return. Very good. Tariq Carpenter, they drafted in the 7th round. I believe they drafted him specifically for special teams. So they were able to address the offensive line, the front 7, receiver position, and special teams. So overall, when we, look at what the biggest needs were entering the draft, I feel like they checked a bunch of those boxes, even though they did not get the round 1 receiver.
And when you look at the way that the season ended and the emphasis that fans, that's kind of a bitter taste that's left in their mouths in terms of special teams. How much do you ultimately think that impacts the decision making for those who are in the draft room and kind of assessing what the team needs, particularly if you're not going to go for that big superstar receiver, or if you don't have the top pick in the draft? I hear what you're saying about take what the draft ultimately gives you, and sometimes the board just falls the way that it falls. And this one was certainly unique compared to others that we've seen, other draft classes that we've seen. But how much of an impact do you think the way the season ended made in ultimately determining how they address special teams?
Early on in the draft, I don't think whatsoever. Once you start to get to round 6 and 7 specifically, I have to think that it was in the back of their minds. Like I said, Tariq Carpenter, I think he has over 400 special team snaps from his time at Georgia Tech. His straight line speed was very, very fast. Again, that's a good quality to have on special teams. And just overall this offseason, I think we've seen more of an emphasis on it from Green Bay than what we have in the past. They went and signed the Raiders interim coach, Rich Bisaccia, to be their special teams coordinator. And on top of that, they signed Pat O'Donnell, the punter, to come in. Keyshawn Nixon, he's a cornerback, but he was a core special teams player with the Raiders under Bisaccia. And then you see the addition of Tariq Carpenter. And like I said, potentially Watson and Doubs could help the return units as well. So unlike years past, it does seem like there's definitely more of an emphasis on it. And that's one of the things I talked about this offseason. The organizational view of special teams has to change. The type of players that you bring in, because typically in Green Bay, a lot of undrafted rookies or young guys, those are your special teams players. Whereas maybe now it's going to shift towards, maybe we want someone with a little bit more experience. Or Keyshawn Nixon, he's probably not going to see many snaps on defense, but I think, again, they signed him for that special teams ability. So, and practice time as well. That's another area, and we won't see that, but that's another area where hopefully there's just more emphasis on it. So I think anyways, we're seeing the pendulum at least shift where, okay, we need to definitely focus on this more than what we have in the past.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that these guys need about 3 years to develop. And what have you done for me lately, league? And you see some of these teams that bring in these players and they can make an immediate impact. But the majority of the time, it is actually about player development, even though people want to win right now. So unexpected, but effective. We will take it from Paul Bretl. Thank you so much for the comprehensive breakdown of the draft. And again, go to Dairyland Express if you're a diehard Packers fan, if you really want to read into every single one of these picks and the potential impact that they can have on the Packers this season. Paul is the man for the job. Paul, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.